For decades, the United States believed something very simple. If you go far enough, you're safe. That distance protects you. That there are places on the map where war cannot reach. That assumption just broke. Because in the last few hours, Iran did something that changes the geometry of this entire conflict. It reached a place that was never supposed to be reachable. And once that happens, this is no longer just about one strike. It's about the collapse of a system that was built on distance. Main script. There is a piece of this conflict unfolding right now that is not being understood at the level it should be. Not because it is small, not because it is secondary, but because it doesn't fit the way most people are still looking at this war. Most coverage is stuck inside a battlefield frame. Missiles, interceptions, damage reports, statements. All of that matters, but it is not the deepest story. Because what just happened is not just a strike, it's a structural shift. Iran struck Diego Garcia. And if that name doesn't immediately stand out, that's exactly why this matters. Because Diego Garcia was never supposed to be part of the fight. It's not a symbolic outpost. It's one of the most important strategic locations in the American military system. A remote island in the Indian Ocean, used for long-range operations, logistics, and deep strike capability. But more importantly, it was supposed to be safe. That was the entire point. Far enough away to matter, and far enough away to survive. It represented something critical, strategic depth, a place where assets could operate without being inside the immediate threat zone. That is what has now been challenged, and the significance of this moment is not about damage. It's about what was revealed. For years, the accepted understanding was that Iran's missile range was around 2,000 kilometers. That number shaped everything. Where assets were placed, what was considered safe, what was considered exposed. Diego Garcia sits roughly twice that distance. That's why it was chosen. Because it was believed to be outside the threat envelope. Iran just reached it. That is the event. Not just that missiles were launched, but that they arrived at a location that was not supposed to be reachable. And once that happens, the entire logic of distance changes. Because in strategic terms, reach matters more than precision. Proving you can get there is enough to force change. Because the moment distance stops guaranteeing safety, everything has to be reconsidered. That's why the question, did it hit perfectly, misses the point. The real question is anything still outside the threat envelope? And right now, the answer looks very different than it did before. This is where the real problem begins. Because military planning depends on assumptions like this. How far can the adversary reach? Which assets are safe? Where can you operate with confidence? If those assumptions are wrong, everything built on them becomes unstable. And this isn't just about one base. It's about everything that was classified using the old model. If the real range is double what was believed, then an entire layer of global positioning just changed. Places that were considered safe are no longer clearly safe. Rear areas start looking like forward vulnerabilities. And that's not something you adjust quickly. It affects basing, defense systems, logistics, allied coordination. And worst of all, it has to be adjusted while the conflict is still ongoing. There is no pause. That's what makes this so dangerous. Because mistakes discovered in peacetime can be corrected slowly. Mistakes discovered during war create immediate exposure. Now add the political dimension, because this is where it gets even more serious. There were already public claims suggesting that Iran's missile capability had been significantly reduced, that it had been degraded, that it was no longer a major factor. And now, missiles have traveled over 4,000 kilometers. That creates a credibility problem, because the obvious question becomes unavoidable. If the capability was neutralized, what just happened? There is no clean answer to that. And that turns this into more than a military issue. It becomes a narrative problem, a credibility problem, for intelligence, for leadership, for everything that was said before this moment. And once credibility cracks, every future claim becomes harder to trust. Now go one layer deeper, because the most concerning part may not be the strike itself, it's what it implies. There are only a few ways this could have happened. Either the capability was hidden, or it was underestimated, or it was misunderstood. None of those are reassuring, because they all lead to the same conclusion. The threat model was incomplete. And once you admit that, the next question becomes even more dangerous. What else is incomplete? What else is being assumed that hasn't been tested yet? That's where uncertainty starts spreading. And uncertainty forces overreaction, more defense, more caution, more cost. Because once you don't trust the map anymore, you have to assume the worst-case version of it. This is how strategic shock works. One event exposes a flaw. That flaw spreads doubt. That doubt forces change across the system. And that brings us to the bigger picture. Because Diego Garcia was not just a base, it was reassurance. Even if forward systems came under pressure, there was still depth, still a layer that could operate safely. That's what allowed confidence. But if that layer is no longer clearly protected, the entire posture changes, because you lose something critical: certainty. And certainty is a hidden resource in war. If you believe something is safe, you act aggressively. If you don't, you slow down. You become defensive. You hesitate. And that's exactly what an adversary wants. They don't always need to destroy the safe zone. Sometimes it's enough to prove it doesn't exist. That's what this strike did. It didn't just hit a location. It challenged the idea of untouchability. It told planners, distance is no longer protection. It told allies, reevaluate your assumptions. And it raised a question that will now spread everywhere. If this can be reached, what can't? That question won't stay limited. Allies will reassess. Host nations will reconsider risk. Military systems will be reevaluated globally. Because once a threat expands, doctrine has to follow. That means new defenses, new costs, new vulnerabilities, all while the conflict continues. That's the real pressure. Because adaptation takes time, but exposure is immediate. And that's why this moment matters more than it looks. Because it changes the geometry of the war, not the scale of destruction, the scale of reach. Diego Garcia used to represent depth. Now it represents something else: exposure. And that's a fundamental shift. Because it suggests that what was once considered contained is no longer contained. That the battlefield is bigger than expected. That the assumptions behind the strategy were incomplete. And that realization is happening, not before the war, but during it. That's what makes it so dangerous. So let's put it clearly. The significance of this moment is not that a remote base was targeted. It's that a sanctuary may no longer be a sanctuary. Not that missiles traveled far, but that they traveled farther than expected. Not that damage occurred, but that the underlying model has been challenged. This is the kind of event that forces everything to be reconsidered at once: doctrine, positioning, credibility. And once that happens, the conflict changes. Because now decisions are being made under uncertainty, under pressure, under a map that no longer looks the same. Subscribe if you want analysis that goes beyond headlines and explains what these moments actually mean. And before you go, answer this. If distance no longer guarantees safety, what does safe even mean in modern war?